Hello, Pebble. You're gonna get sick of me. I thought I'd do another chapter seeing as I had a spare hour, and two reasons. One is that my counsellor basically said that I should make some time just for me, for something I really enjoyed each day. And I'm like thinking, well, what do I enjoy most of all each day? Ooh. And it was not a difficult decision to make, to be perfectly honest. So I thought I'm going to set aside some time, seeing as I have an unexpected hour that I wasn't expecting. I guess that's what makes it unexpected. Thank you for all the lovely comments. I appreciate you. And I'm really glad you like the narrative. That's kind of, as I said, it helps me to help the book flow, and it kind of keeps me engaged with it as well. Because I think sometimes narrators, you can hear it in audiobooks when they're reading, and they turn into an automaton and they don't engage with the book. And I want to keep engaging, you know. I want to kind of like show that I am reading and I am absorbing it. I'm not just reading it out loud. Right. There was another reason I was thinking of, but it's just gone kapoof out of my mind. So there you go. And that was it. I would like to kind of give you 2 to 3 chapters a week. That's generally how I used to do it. I don't know how I got so flaky so quickly, but, you know, thank you to Rose for the honey and to everybody else, you know who you are, for the support and encouragement. I do appreciate you, and you're so patient, and I don't deserve you, and you're just phenomenal people. So, yes. If you could hit the like button, if you enjoy the content, and if you do listen to it all the way through, that's amazeballs, because it helps my my algorithm. It just basically just means that it's been a listen. And it's normally difficult with people who do long form videos like this to get a decent sort of like algorithm going, but it is what it is. I've got my little group. We have got our little group, and it's lovely. Right. 2 minutes of waffling. I can generally tell when I've been whiffling on for 2 minutes. I'm like, oh goodness. Right, my lovely beans. As I said, if you could, you know, hit the like button and notifications bell and share and subscribe if you don't already. And if you're new, hello, welcome to our little cozy corner of the internet. We're going to do chapter 5 of Flying Dutch by Mr. Tom Holt, with some little introspections and little reviews as we go along.
Can I speak?
Vanderdecker shouted.
To Professor Montalban.
In a long life, reflected the Flying Dutchman, I've come across many bloody silly ideas, but 2 of them are in a class of their own for pure, untainted idiocy. One was the court of King Ludwig of Bavaria, and the other is a privatised British telephone service. Narrator's note, BT, do you remember Busby on the telephone lines? A long way away, definitely in another continent, and quite probably in another dimension, a little voice asked him to repeat the name.
Montalban,
he said.
M for mouse.
The lovely part of it was that he was standing in a telephone kiosk within sight of the gates of a power station he was telephoning. If he was to shout just a little bit louder, they'd be able to hear him without using the phone at all. Who's calling, please? Said the voice.
My name's Vanderdecker,
Vanderdecker said. I'm sorry, said the voice. I didn't quite...
Vanderdecker! Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to shout. It's not a very good line. Oh, I see. When do you expect him back?
Professor Montalban has gone to Geneva, said the voice. We don't expect him back for a week or so. Will you hold?
No,
said the Flying Dutchman.
That's fine. Have you got a number for him in...
Could you speak up, please? The voice said. It's rather a poor line.
Have you got a number where I can reach a professor in Geneva?
Vanderdecker enunciated. The voice said no, she didn't. Could she take a message? Vanderdecker thanked her and hung up. Now, even on his antiquated maps, Geneva was clearly marked as being a long way from the sea. Not from water, but from the sea. All in all, it would be foolish to risk trying to reach him in there. Vanderdecker pressed the little lever, but no change came cascading down into the tray marked returned coins. There would be nothing for it, he said to himself, but to put out to sea for a while until the good professor came back. For above the 7,000th time, Vanderdecker assured himself that the alchemist would be as keen to see him as he was to see the alchemist. If Montalban was even remotely concerned with the same field of research as he had been in the reign of His Most Catholic Majesty Philip II, it stood to reason that he would welcome a chance to examine his very first human guinea pigs. His reading of scientific journals had taught him a lot about the way scientists think. They like to have plenty of data. Narrator's note, so do I. Vanderdecker had a ship full of data. Noisome, foul-smelling data. It was true, but... At this point a thought entered into Vanderdecker's mind. During the short time it stayed there, it made its presence felt in more or less the same way a hand grenade would assert itself in a glassworks. If Montalban had drunk exactly the same stuff as he had, presumably Montalban had been subject to exactly the same side effects. Yet, here the alchemist apparently was, spending a week here, a fortnight there, completely surrounded by human beings, and it was by no means unlikely that he had gone to Geneva in an aeroplane, and that while there he would stay in a hotel. If he was able to do these things, it necessarily floored that he didn't smell. How was this? In Caithness, many of the portsmen still ride bicycles. If without any warning they get downwind of a member of the crew of the sailing ship Verdonde, they tend to ride these bicycles into trees. The sound of a portsman's head making contact with a Scots pine brought Vanderdecker back out of his reverie. He was being antisocial again. Time to move on. While he had been away, the crew had passed the time by going for a swim in the sea. Complete immersion in seawater did nothing to impede the communication of the smell, but it did make you feel a little bit better. Now the water around Dune Ray has been declared completely safe by NIREX, which may be taken to mean that it's about as safe as a gavotte in a minefield, but from the point of view of Vanderdecker's crew, this was a point in its favour. They could bathe in it with a clean conscience if it was polluted already. By some strange accident of chance, it was Antonius, the first mate, who noticed it first. A comedy that is not lost on me. And this in spite of the fact that the odds against Antonius noticing anything at any given time are so astronomical as to be beyond calculation. The next person to notice it was Sebastian van Durning. He only noticed it because after his 9th attempt to drown himself, he was so short of breath that he was inhaling air like a vacuum pump. Then Pieter and Dirk Pretorius noticed it, and they pointed it out to Jan Christian Duisberg. He in turn mentioned it to Wilhelm Treigart, who told him that he was imagining things. In short, by the time Vanderdecker returned, everyone was aware of it. They all decided to tell their captain at the same time.
"Hold on, will you?"
Vanderdecker said. There was a brief but total silence, and then everyone started talking again.
"Quiet!"
A man who had just spent 5 minutes talking into a British Telecom payphone is not afraid to raise his voice.
"Sebastian,"
he said, choosing someone at random.
"can you please tell me what is going on?"
"It's the smell, Captain,"
replied the spokesman.
"It's gone."
Vanderdecker stared. Then he sniffed so violently that he almost dislocated his windpipe.
"When did this happen?"
he asked quietly.
"Must have been when we were all swimming in the water, Captain,"
Sebastian said.
"You don't say."
Vanderdecker closed his eyes, buried his nose in Antonius's doublet and concentrated. There was still a whiff of it there, but it was very faint.
"This water here?"
"That's right," several voices assured him. Others urged him to try it for himself. They didn't want to be rude, they said, but he smelled awful. Vanderdecker needed no second invitation. He pulled off his shirt and trousers and jumped into the sea.
"I do believe you're right,"
he said a quarter of an hour later. They were back on board ship again by this stage. The ship itself was as bad as ever, but what could you expect?
"It's definitely still there, but it's faded a hell of a lot."
"What do you think's happened?" asked the first mate anxiously.
"What's going on?"
Vanderdecker had a shrewd idea that it wasn't a coincidence. He didn't know much about these things, but it stood to reason that the sea next to a power station absorbs quite a fair amount of any escaping vapours or things of that sort. Now, until a few days ago, Professor Montalban had been doing experiments inside that very same power station. If that is a coincidence, Vanderdecker said to himself, then I'm not a Dutchman. An hour later, though, it had worn off. The cloud of avaricious gulls which had formed over the ship suddenly evaporated. The fumes from Wilhelm Treigart's repulsive pipe were once again the sweetest smelling things on the ship. Because he had his immersion later than the others, Vanderdecker was slightly more wholesome than they were, but only slightly. He would still have been barred from any fashionable sewer as a health hazard. Vanderdecker said,
"Get me all the empty barrels you can find. Then fill them up in the sea where you lot were all having your swim.
Antonius, who was a conscientious man, felt it his duty to point out to Vanderdecker that you can't drink seawater. Vanderdecker ignored him politely, because he was thinking again.
It no longer matters,
he said to himself. Geneva can be on top of the Alps, for all I care. If we can keep ourselves from smelling for just a couple of days, we could make it to Geneva and go and see Montalban. Now, while we are on the subject of coincidences, how else would you account for the fact that the Dow Jones' second biggest slide in 20 years started that same afternoon? Narrator's note, the Dow Jones normally gets it right. Anyway, the most direct route by sea from Dounray to Geneva, so to speak, is straight down the North Sea and into the Channel. Vanderdecker, however, was extremely unhappy about going anywhere near the Channel now that it was so depressingly full of ships. He made for Den Helder. Yet another of these wretched coincidences. MV Erdkrieger, the flagship of the environmentalist pressure group Green Machine, left Den Helder at exactly the same time on the same day that Vanderdecker left Scotland. It was headed for Dounray. Its progress was slightly impeded by its cargo of 6,000 tons of slightly wilted flowers, contributed by Green Machine's Dutch militant sister organisation Unilateral Tulip, which the Erdkrieger's crew intended to use to block the effluent outlets of the newly built fifth-generation reactor, whose construction and installation Professor Montalban, better known as in environmental circles as the Great Satan, was presently supervising. As a result, the Erdkrieger was not her usual nippy self. She was going about as fast as, for example, a 16th century merchantman under full sail.
Now then,
said Mr. Gleeson,
the Vanderdecker policy.
Mr. Gleeson was not what Jane had expected, but then she shouldn't have expected him to be, not if she'd thought about it for a moment. What she should have expected was an extraordinary man, and for all his shortcomings, he was certainly that. He was short, maybe half an inch shorter than Jane, who was a quintessential size 12. He was round, but not fat, and his head had hair in more or less the same way a mountain has grass, sparse and short and harassed-looking. He had bright, quick, precise eyes, and a smile that told you that he would make jokes, but not laugh at yours. As to 90% of him, he looked like somebody else's nice uncle. The other 10% you felt was probably pure barracuda.
I don't know, said Mr. Gleeson, how much you found out for yourself, so I'd better start at the beginning. Would you like something before we start? Cup of tea, gin and tonic, sherry?
Jane had never been in Mr. Gleeson's office before, and she didn't feel at all comfortable. It was an unsettling place, just comfortable enough to make you start to feel at home, and just businesslike enough to make you suddenly realise that you weren't. Jane had the perception to understand that this effect was deliberate. "No, thank you," she said. Her mouth was like emery paper. Mr. Gleeson reclined in his chair and looked at his fingernails for a moment.
The Vanderdecker policy,
he said,
is the single most important secret in the world. I don't want to worry you unduly, but when you leave this office tonight, you'll be taking with you enough information to wipe out every major financial institution and destabilize every economy in the world. I just thought you ought to know that. You can keep a secret, can't you?
Jane mumbled that yes, she could. Mr. Gleeson nodded. He accepted her word on this point. He was a good judge of character and could read people.
Actually, he continued, the risk involved in telling you this is minimal, because if you leaked it to anybody, they wouldn't believe you. I'm not sure they'd even believe me, or the President of the United States. Narrator's note, biting my tongue to answer that one. For that matter, when you actually come face to face with the true story, it's so completely incredible that you could publish it in the Investor's Chronicle, and it wouldn't make a blind bit of difference. What we've been trying to cover up ever since long before you were born, is not what the secret is, but that it exists. And mainly, of course, we're trying to deal with the actual problem, so by the time it does get out, it will one day, it must, there's no stopping it, we will have solved it, and that will be that. Now then,
Mr. Gleeson scratched his ear slowly and gently, as if this was a very delicate and difficult feat to perform and required all of his concentration. Then he leaned forward.
So that you can understand what I'm going to say, he continued, I'd best just fill you in on the history of the firm's most important client. You don't need me to tell you that it's the National Lombard Bank. It's a very old bank. In fact, it's the oldest bank of all. To be honest with you, nobody knows exactly when it was founded. It started off as a large number of silver pennies in a sock belonging to an Italian merchant who was too fat to go to the Crusades in person, but was alive to the fantastic commercial opportunity they presented. These silver pennies bred so many other silver pennies during the siege of Jerusalem that the sock was too small to contain them all, and the Italian merchant, or his grandson, or whoever it was, built a bank instead and kept doing that. Spiritually, however, the whole organisation remained a sock, and a sock it is to this day. Remember that, and you'll understand a lot about how banks work. For reasons best known to itself, the sock left Lombardy early in the 14th century and migrated to the cities of the Hanseatic League, where it went to live with some people called Fugger. They were kind to the sock and fed it lots of silver pennies until almost all the silver pennies in the world were either in the sock permanently or else indefeasibly linked to it by a series of binding legal agreements. The more people tried to take money out of the sock, the more money ended up in there, and although everyone complained bitterly about this state of affairs, none of them realised that the only way to break the vicious circle was not to take money out of the sock in the first place. Even now, said Mr. Gleeson, the lesson has not been learned, which is why the economic infrastructure of the developed nations is completely up the pictures. Anyway, continued Mr. Gleeson, the Fuggers were industrious men, and they weren't content to let the sock do all the work. They were forever trying to think up new ideas for getting even more silver pennies from people, and one of them hit on a very simple but extremely effective concept. It was basically a form of gambling, and it went something like this. The Fuggers would think of something that was extremely unlikely to happen, and they would persuade someone to wager the money that it would. Now, the proper term for this arrangement is a sucker bet, but the Fuggers wanted to find a respectable name for it, so they called it insurance. It caught on, just as they knew it would, and soon it became so respectable that they were able to get people to make a new bet every year, and they called this sort of bet a premium. But although everyone was soon convinced that bets were totally respectable, the Fuggers were perfectionists and wanted to make absolutely sure, so they took to writing the bets out on extremely long pieces of parchment, frequently in Latin. This practice survives to this day. We call them policies, and usually they're so completely and utterly respectable that it takes a couple of trained lawyers to understand exactly what they mean. Jane nodded instinctively, for she had just renewed her car insurance. Mr. Gleeson went on. Well, he said, if we can just fast forward for a bit, the House of Fugger became Fugger and Company, which in turn became the Lombard National Bank, which turned into the National Lombard Bank plc. The name has changed, but the sock remains the same. In fact, you would be forgiven for thinking that the sock is the only truly immortal entity in the world. You would be wrong. Mr. Gleeson paused and opened the top drawer of his desk, from which he extracted a packet of digestive biscuits. Narrator's note, chocolate, digestive. He offered one to Jane, who refused, and then ate one himself. Once he had cleared his mouth of crumbs, he continued. Back we go. Narrator's note, do you know people actually sometimes have cheese on digestive biscuits? I don't get it. Back we go to the 16th century. We are in Cadiz, one of the most important seaports in the world. If you are tired of Cadiz, you are tired of life, and so on. Naturally, there is a Fugger office in the High Street, offering low-interest overdrafts, mortgages. The word mortgage literally means dead hand, which I find terribly evocative, don't you? Bottomry loans, whatever they were, and the inevitable life insurance. It is a Thursday. Into the Fugger office walks a relatively prosperous sea captain in his early 30s. He has become rather concerned about the risks involved in his profession now that the seas are full of English pirates, and he wants to take out some insurance on his ship. This is perfectly natural, because his ship is his living, and if somebody puts a culverin ball through its bows, our sea captain will be out of a job. The manager of this particular fugger office is well versed in the basic tenets of his trade, and the fundamental rule of insurance is, don't take bad risks. That, by the way, is what an insurer calls a sucker bet when you offer it to him. There is a severe risk that the sea captain fears so much that will actually come to pass. Therefore, regretfully, the manager has to refuse to insure the ship. But he is nothing if not a trier. It hurts him severely if someone walks out of his office without making at least a small bet. And so he suggests to sea captain that he might do worse and take out a little bit of life insurance.
Narrator's note, I've got to say I've got to really focus on pronouncing fugger. and not what else it could yeah. Anyway, again, Mr. Gleeson paused, and Jane noticed to her amazement that he was quivering slightly. Mr. Gleeson must have noticed her noticing, for he smiled.
This is the good bit, he said. Don't go away. I remember when I was told it. By rights, of course, I should never have been told it at all. You see, the story is handed down from generation to generation of managing directors in the House of Fugger, or whatever they're calling it this week. Fortunately, the managing directors of the bank had always died in their beds with plenty of notice from the medical authorities, and so there was always time to pass the story on. The way I get to hear it was extremely fortuitous, a complete break with tradition, you might say. You see, I was at Oxford with the son of the then managing director, and I was staying with the family one long vacation. We all went out rough shooting, and there was a terrible accident. The old man got shot. No time to get a doctor. He just rolled over and with his dying breath blurted the whole horrible thing out. I happened to be there, and so of course I heard it. I wasn't even qualified then, but of course I became the bank's chief auditor on the spot, just as my friend became the next managing director, because of what we had heard. You see, the system is that the whole board knows there's a secret, but only the MD knows what the secret is. I've introduced the same system at Moss Berwick, but it doesn't seem to have worked quite so well there.
So, what is the secret exactly? Jane asked.
I'm coming to that, said the senior partner. I was trying to put it off for as long as possible because it's so silly, I suppose is what you'd have to call it, if you were going to be savagely honest. I've lived with this for 30 years, my entire life, and phenomenal successes in my career are built around it, and I've never told anyone before.
Jane looked him in the eye. She was sorry for him. Go on, she said.
Thank you,
said Mr. Gleeson. He was probably quite nice when you got to know him. Should you live that long?
The policy that the manager sold Captain Vanderdecker, the sea captain's name was Vanderdecker, was a perfectly standard policy, especially designed to meet the needs, or rather the gullibility, of sea captains. You had the choice of paying regular premiums or a single lump sum premium. The sea captains found it difficult to pay regular premiums in those days, you see, because they rarely knew where they'd be at any given time from one year's end to the other. And in return, you get an assured sum on death. It wasn't exactly a fortune, but it would tide your nearest and dearest over until the plague or the Inquisition finally finished her off, and since there was no income tax in those days, it was guaranteed to be tax-free. The sting in the tail was this. Because sea captaining was such a risky job in those days, it was a virtual certainty that the policyholder wouldn't make 60 years of age. This was where the sucker bet part of it comes in. Because of this actuarial semi-certainty, the policy contains the proviso that the sum assured, the payout, will increase by 50% compound for every year that the life assured, the sucker, survives over the age of 75. 75, mark you. Those fuggers were taking no chances. It made a marvellous selling point, and the age limitation only appeared in very tiny script on the back of the policy, just underneath the seal where you wouldn't think of looking, hiding. They sold tens of thousands of these policy, and for every one sucker that made 76, there were 999 that just didn't.
Mr. Gleeson stopped talking and sat very still for a while, so still that Jane was afraid to interrupt him. It is very quiet indeed in a soundproofed office on the 15th floor of an office block at 2 in the morning.
Talking of sucker bets, Mr. Gleeson finally said, this one was the best of the lot. You see, Captain Vanderdecker did not die. He just went on living. Nobody knows why. There are all sorts of far-fetched stories which I won't bore you with because your credulity must be strained to breaking point already. The fact remains that Vanderdecker did not die. He is still alive over 400 years later. Please bear in mind the fact that the interest is compound. We tried to calculate once what it must be now, but we couldn't. There is quite literally not that much money in the whole world. So you see, if Vanderdecker dies, the whole thing will go into reverse. All the money which has gone into the sock, and that's every penny there is, will have to come out again, and it will all go to Mr. Vanderdecker's estate. This is, of course, impossible, and so the bank would have to default. It would have to welsh on a sucker bet, and that would be that. End of civilization as we know it. You know as well as I do that the economics of the major economic powers are so volatile that the markets collapse every time the mayor of Accrington gets a bad cold. The faintest hint that the National Lombard was about to go down and you wouldn't be able to give 5 yards down Wall Street without being hit by a free-falling market maker. And that is the basic story behind the Vanderdecker policy.
That same long, deafening silence came back again, until Jane could bear it no longer. But surely, Jane said, if Vanderdecker is going to live forever, he'll never die, and the problem will never arise? Mr. Gleeson smiled.
Who said he was going to live forever? He replied, all we know is that he hasn't died yet. It's scientifically impossible for a man to live forever. Logically, he must die eventually, and every year he does not die, the problem gets inexpressibly worse. You see the trouble we're in. We can't afford for him to die, any more than we can afford for him to live any longer. 50% compound. Think about that for a moment, will you?
Jane thought about it, and she shuddered. So, where is he now? She asked.
We don't know, said Mr. Gleeson. We lost track of him in the 1630s, and then he kept turning up again. He turns up once every 7 years or so, and then he vanishes off the face of the earth.
Suddenly, Jane remembered something. You mean, like the Flying Dutchman? She said.
Vanderdecker is the Flying Dutchman, said Mr. Gleeson. The very same.
I see, Jane said, as if this suddenly made everything crystal clear. So, where does Bridport come in?
I was coming to that, said Mr. Gleeson, just as soon as I'd given you time to digest what I have just told you. Obviously, you've got remarkable digestion, or you think I'm as mad as a hatter. Bridport comes in because that's where Vanderdecker was last recorded in this country. He opened an account at the bank's Bridport branch in 1890-something. I believe you found it.
I did, Jane confirmed. Why on earth haven't you closed it?
Easy, replied Mr. Gleeson. We can't close it without either his instructions or sight of his death certificate. Rules are rules.
Jane was astounded. The last thing she had expected was integrity. But what about bank charges? She said. Couldn't you just write it off against those?
No bank charges, an 1890 thing, replied Gleeson. It wouldn't be right. There would be an anomaly which would have to be noted in the accounts. As the bank's auditor, I would have to insist on it.
I see, Jane said again. I didn't realise the rules were quite so strict.
All we can do, said Mr. Gleeson, is keep very, very quiet about it. The only people who know the significance of that account are me, the chairman of the bank, and now you. Obviously the local manager does not know, and if anyone finds out apart from us, of course, we hound them to insanity and have them locked up in a mental hospital.
That's within rules, is it?
I've read them very carefully, Mr. Gleeson replied. No mention of it anywhere. Therefore it stands to reason it must be legitimate.
In that case, Jane said slowly, why haven't I...
Because, replied Mr. Gleeson, you have no sense of smell.
For the third time, Jane asserted that she saw. She lacked conviction, of course.
Let me explain, said Mr. Gleeson. There is one other thing we know about the Flying Dutchman. He smells awful. You've heard of the Marie Celeste?
Jane said that yes, she had.
National Lombard were part of the syndicate insuring her, so it carried out its own investigation. It found the only survivor.
Ah.
Well, you might say, replied Mr. Gleeson. As soon as the managing director found out what was going on, he cleared everyone else out of the way and spoke to the man personally. Just before he died of acute bewilderment, he reported how they were all sitting there minding their own business when this old-fashioned sailing ship came alongside. There was this smell, the survivor said. It was so bad, he said. Everyone jumped into the sea and was drowned, except him. The old-fashioned ship picked him up just before he was about to drown and took him on board. He was on the ship for 3 weeks before it dropped him off. He described the smell in detail. That bit of the report runs to 479 pages, so you can see it made quite the impression on him. Anyway, it turned out that the name of the ship's captain was indeed Vanderdecker. Since the name is not common, and the survivor said the whole crew were in 16th century costume, it's a fair assumption that it was him. There have been other incidents since which corroborate the story, but the names don't mean anything to you because they happened in remote places and the bank managed to cover them up in time. It is an undoubted fact that Vanderdecker smells so horrible that nobody in the world can bear to be in his presence for more than a few seconds at a time. This, said Mr. Gleeson, is where you come in.
I see, Jane said, for the 4th time.
What we want you to do, said Mr. Gleeson, is find Vanderdecker and reason with him. Tell him he can't take it with him. Negotiate with him to surrender the policy in return for an annuity, £1 million a year for life, or some such figure. It would be worth it. If the bank can afford it, you'd be on commission, naturally.
But how do I find him? Jane said. If it were possible, surely you'd have done it by now.
We haven't dared try, Mr. Gleeson replied. In order to find Vanderdecker, we'd have to let too many people in on too much of the secret. Far too risky. Sucker bet. Only someone like you can do it, because you know already, and you only know because I have told you, and I've only told you because you have no sense of smell. Do you follow me?
I think so, Jane said. More or less. Actually, I might have a lead already. And she told him about Lower Brickwood Farm Cottage and the invoices. When she had finished, Miss Gleeson nodded and smiled. You can call me Bill sort of smile that he usually reserved for prime ministers.
Will you help us then? He said. If you succeed, you can name your own fee.
Well, Jane hesitated, genuinely doubtful. If she accepted the job, she would have to find some way of coming to terms with what she had just been told, and that would not be easy, not by a long chalk. On the other hand, and bearing in mind all the material circumstances, with a particular regard to the section of the rules which said nothing at all about locking people up in lunatic asylums, she felt she didn't have much choice. Yes, she said. Mr. Gleeson grinned at her.
That's the spirit, he said. May the sock be with you.
That was awesome. Oh, I'm so glad I actually got through that. It's been a rough couple of days, I'm so sorry, but at least we're on track. We're on track, my lovely beans. So there has been a split in the middle. I've recorded this over 2 days, so how are you doing? How are things going? What's happening? What's going on? I'm trying to avoid all of the news just so I can just keep puddling along in my little world of fantasy and wonderful peoples. As ever, my lovely beans, if you enjoyed that chapter, if you could hit the like button, that would be a massive help. Kind of keeps everything ticking over, keeps the bills paid, as it were. Well, it doesn't keep the bills paid, but you know what I mean. Kind of like just help out the channel in the long run. Yes, we love this. We love this indeed. I mean, I'm not really bothered about followers because I've got you guys. You guys are awesome and I adore your souls. I was chuckling because there was the quote of yesterday and it's like, I can't see, there's too much dinosaur in the way. That was one of the quotes of yesterday. That made me happy. Oh, I've got to write them all down. Yes. But there is a chronicle somewhere of some of my inkisms, my phrases. Yes. That's all we shall say on that matter. Only the fact that it makes me smile. Oh, lovely beans, lovely beans, lovely beans. So I'm absolutely shattered. It's a horrendously busy week this week. So basically, tomorrow I'm getting me loft insulated. And then on Wednesday, I'm getting my new boiler put in. And then on Thursday, I'm getting the electrician put in. But hopefully I should be able to record at some point between all of those. It's totally adulting. It's totally grown up. But you know what? Sometimes we just got to deal with these things. Oh, I got my hardcover copy of The Tower Pooh and the Tay of Piglet from World of Books, which I'm quite chuffed about. Just trying to think what else I can tell you about what's been going on. But because I'm absolutely shattered, and my cats are already shouting for their dinner, but it's only 20 to 2 and they don't have their third meal of the day until 3:30. They're joining in with the dogs. Seriously, you can set your clock by my herd. It's always on the hour or on a half hour. And yeah, they have their very set bedtime and sleepy time. And then throughout the day, it's like, I want to be fed now. I want to be fed now. They eat more than me. And I wouldn't begrudge them that for 1 minute. So, my lovely beans, if you're too hot, hydrate. If you're too cold, wrap up warm and snuggy. And I'll see you hopefully in the next couple of days. So, big love, take it easy and stay safe, pedal. See you soon.